"Whose face is this?" Mia asked, holding the photograph up so close to the candles that Elliot lunged forward before the paper could catch fire. The whole table went quiet. 14 place settings, 4 generations of Ashford family silver, and one 3-year-old had just brought Elliot March's entire life to a stop with a single question. "I'll tell you exactly how we got to that dining room in a second, but first, if you're the kind of person who believes the truth always finds a way out, even when it's buried under 7 years of money and silence, stick around. Tell me in the comments where you're tuned in from tonight. Now let's get into it." 10 weeks earlier, none of this had happened yet. Elliot March was 34 years old and had turned a mid-sized freight company into March Holdings, a shipping and logistics empire that moved cargo through 6 countries and made his name a fixture on business channels he never watched. He lived alone in a house built for a family of 8, on a bluff overlooking the Wilmington River outside Savannah, in a place called Thornfield that the local paper liked to photograph at sunset. He was engaged to a woman named Camille Ashford, whose father sat 2 seats down from Elliot's own on the board, and whose smile Elliot had noticed more than once. Never quite made it to her eyes when she thought no one was watching her closely enough to notice. He hadn't really laughed, the kind that catches you off guard in longer than he could remember. The staff at Thornfield had theories about that. Something had happened to him once, before the money, before anyone outside a shipping yard had ever heard the name March. Dolores Whitcomb, who'd run that house for 14 years, knew more than she let on, which was its own kind of confession if you paid attention. Renata Cruz had been hired 6 months before any of this started, through an agency that specialized in people who didn't ask questions and didn't repeat what they overheard. She kept to herself in a way the rest of the staff found almost unfriendly. And she brought her daughter to the house most mornings before the sitter came for her, a small mercy Dolores had arranged without asking Elliot, correctly guessing he'd never notice. She was wrong about that part. "Hi," Mia told him the first week, planted directly in the hallway outside his study like she'd been assigned there. Not quite 3 yet. 2 crooked braids her mother had clearly done in a hurry. Elliot looked down at her the way he looked at an unexplained charge on a quarterly report. "Hello, you have a sad face," she informed him and wandered off before he could think of a response. He'd stood in the hallway of his own 11,000-square-foot house, feeling unsteady for reasons he refused to examine. It became a pattern after that. Mia talked to him through the study door whenever her mother's back was turned. She left him things, a rock she decided was special, a drawing that might have been a boat or might have been a dog. One single sock she insisted belonged to him, even though it very obviously didn't. He found himself some nights standing in his own doorway, looking at a crayon drawing taped crookedly to his desk lamp, unable to throw it away and unable to say why. Renata apologized for her daughter constantly. "She doesn't understand boundaries yet," she said one morning, lifting Mia out of the chair behind Elliot's desk where she'd wedged herself uninvited. "I'm working on it." "Don't," Elliot said before he decided to say anything at all. "It's fine." Renata looked at him a second too long. Something crossed her face he couldn't read. Then she was gone, Mia on her hip, and Elliot stood there wondering what exactly he'd just handed over. There was something about her that unsettled him in a way he couldn't name, not attraction, or not only that, something closer to recognition. A word sitting right on the tip of his tongue that he couldn't quite pull forward. He caught himself watching the line of her shoulders when she didn't know he was looking. He caught himself listening for her voice down the hall before he'd admit to himself that's what he was doing. He told himself it meant nothing. He was engaged. Camille was sharp, ambitious, photographed beautifully beside him at every fundraiser his board required him to attend. On paper, the marriage would be exactly the success everyone expected it to be. He didn't let himself sit too long with the fact that the thought made something in his chest go hollow. It was Dolores who handed him the first loose thread, though she hadn't meant to. He'd mentioned offhand that Mia's mother seemed sharper than most of the household staff, nothing more than an observation. Dolores had been folding towels in the hallway, and her hands went still. "Renata's had a hard road," she said carefully. "Lost her older sister a few years back. Doesn't talk about it. What was the sister's name?" Dolores' eyes flicked up to his, then away a half-second too fast. "Anna." On a cruise, something shifted in Elliot's chest, small, strange, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He couldn't have told you why the name unsettled him. He filed it away and told himself it was nothing. He should have known by now that nothing in his life was ever actually nothing. 2 weeks after that, Elliot came home early from a meeting that got canceled and found his study door standing open. He pushed it the rest of the way, already annoyed, expecting a cleaning mistake. Instead, he found Renata frozen at his desk, the bottom drawer, the one he kept locked, the one that held nothing that should have mattered to anyone but him, pulled open in front of her. She was holding a photograph, his photograph, the one he'd hidden away years ago and never once let anyone see. "What are you doing?" His voice came out harder than he meant it to. Harder than he'd used on anyone in that house in months. Her head snapped up, something flashed across her face, not guilt exactly. Fear, the old kind. The kind that lives in a person's body long after the danger that put it there is gone. "I'm sorry," she said, setting the photograph down with a care that made it look like it might shatter. "The drawer was already open. I swear I wasn't looking for. That drawer is locked." "I know it was open. I wasn't trying to—" She stopped herself. "You weren't trying to what?" Her eyes met his, and for one unguarded second Elliot saw something in them he couldn't name. Recognition. The exact word that had been sitting on the tip of his tongue for 6 months. "Nothing," she said. "It won't happen again." She left before he could ask another question, and Elliot stood alone with the drawer hanging open, the photograph still lying face up where she'd left it. He picked it up. Studied the woman in it the way he'd studied her 1,000 times before, in hotel rooms, on planes, at 3 in the morning when the house was too quiet to think in. He'd never told a single soul who she was. He'd never told anyone she existed at all. So why, he thought, hands not quite steady, had his housekeeper looked at that photograph like she was looking into a mirror? If you were in Elliot's shoes right there, would you have pushed for the truth on the spot, or waited to see what she gave up on her own? Drop your answer below. I want to know before we go any further because what happens next changes everything. He waited. Some old instinct, the same one that had built an empire out of knowing exactly when to hold back and when to push, told him not to pull on the thread yet, not until he understood what was attached to the other end of it. Instead, the strange, careful thaw between them kept going, mostly because Mia refused to let it do anything else. She'd started greeting him every morning with a full report of her day's plans, delivered with the seriousness of a general briefing troops. "Today I'm gonna find a lizard," she told him one Tuesday, hands on her hips like it was already decided. "And I'm gonna call him Bartholomew." "Solid plan," Elliot said, and was startled by something in his own voice he hadn't heard there in years. Ease, warmth. Renata, hovering in the doorway with an armful of towels, caught his eye and almost smiled before she caught herself and looked away. It was in those small, unguarded minutes that Elliot began to understand something was happening to him that he had no name for and no defense against. He found reasons to come home earlier. He found himself listening for a particular rhythm of small feet on hardwood before he'd admit that's what he was doing. He found, one evening, that he'd spent nearly an hour helping Mia build a tower out of his quarterly reports before he even registered what he was doing with his time. He told himself again that it meant nothing. Camille noticed before he did. She showed up unannounced on a Saturday, 3 weeks ahead of their engagement party, ostensibly to go over the seating chart. Elliot found her in the kitchen instead, standing very still, watching through the window as Mia helped Renata pin laundry to the line in the side yard, shrieking every time a sheet snapped open over her head. "Cute," Camille said in a tone that meant the opposite. "You seem awfully invested in the help's home life." "She's a kid. Kids are loud." "I don't mind it." Camille turned from the window and studied him with the exact attention she usually reserved for competitors. "You've been different lately, softer." "I honestly can't decide if I like it." He didn't answer. He didn't trust what would come out if he tried. That was the first sign Camille had that something in her carefully arranged future was under threat. And Camille Ashford did not tolerate threats to her arrangements. Within the week, Renata was informed, no explanation. Delivered through Camille's assistant and dressed up as a staffing decision, that her duties were being reassigned to the guest cottage effective immediately. Renata didn't argue. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing rarely changed anything for people in her position. She packed up her small corner of the kitchen, gathered Mia's crayons and half-finished drawings, and said nothing. But Mia noticed the distance, even though the grown-ups thought they'd hidden it well. "Why don't we see Elliot anymore?" she asked her mother one night, sitting cross-legged on the cottage bed while Renata braided her hair for the morning. Renata's hands went still. "He's busy, baby. He's not busy, he's sad, I can tell." Renata didn't have an answer for that, not one she was willing to say out loud. Elliot told himself the distance was for the best. He had a merger closing in 6 weeks. He didn't have room in his life for whatever this feeling was. This strange, unfamiliar ache that showed up every time he passed the empty spot by the kitchen window where Mia used to sit and color. He pressed Dollar's again, one evening more directly this time. "Tell me about Anna Cruz." Dollar's face went carefully blank in the way it only did when she was protecting somebody. "Not my story to tell, Mr. March. Dollar's, I mean it. Then ask Renata if you need it that badly. It's hers to give, not mine." He didn't ask Renata, not directly. But he found himself, one Sunday, taking the long way past the guest cottage instead of his usual path to the garage. And he told himself it was a coincidence when he saw Mia through the open window, sitting on the floor with a shoebox of old photographs spread around her, helping her mother sort through them. Mia picked one up and held it to the light, studying it with the same total focus she brought to everything. Then she got up, trotted straight out the cottage door and across the lawn, and didn't stop until she'd planted herself in front of Elliot. "Look," she said, holding it up like a prize. "It's you, but not you." Elliot took it on autopilot, expecting a stranger, expecting nothing. His whole body went cold. It was the same photograph, the one from his locked drawer. The laughing young woman with sunlight caught in her hair. Except this copy had been folded, and unfolded so many times the crease ran straight through the middle of her face. He looked from the photo to the little girl standing in front of him, close enough now that he could finally see it. The thing he'd been too afraid to let himself notice for 6 months. Her hair was her mother's, dark and stubborn. Her chin was her mother's too. But her eyes, the shape of them, that particular gray-green color, belonged to somebody else entirely. They belonged to him. "Mia!" Renata's voice came from the cottage doorway, and this time it wasn't gentle. It was raw, terrified. The voice of a woman watching her whole, carefully built life come apart in real time. "Mia, baby, come back here right now." It was too late. Elliot was already looking up from the photograph to Renata's face. Already running math he hadn't let himself run in 7 years. Already understanding. With a certainty that felt like the ground giving out under him. Exactly why his housekeeper's face had struck him as so impossibly familiar from the very first day. "Renata," his voice came out belonging to someone else. "Who is Mia's father?" Everything changes from here. If a secret has ever caught up with you when you least expected it, tell me about it in the comments. But for now, let's keep going, because Renata's about to tell him the truth. She didn't answer right away. She crossed the lawn instead, lifted Mia onto her hip with hands that were visibly shaking, and stood there holding her daughter like a shield. "Please," she said. Not in front of her. Every instinct Elliot had spent a decade sharpening, read the room, control the story. "Never let anyone watch you come apart." Screamed at him to walk away and handle this later, calmly, like a problem to be managed. He ignored every single one of them. "9 years ago," he said, low and unsteady, "I worked construction on the Portside Yards site under a different name. My father would have destroyed anyone I actually cared about if he'd known who I really was. There was a girl, 20 years old. She ran the coffee cart outside the gate. She had a little sister who used to bring her lunch." Renata's arms tightened around Mia. "She disappeared," Elliot went on, and his voice was breaking open now in a way it hadn't in years, maybe ever. "No note, no explanation. I looked for 2 years before I finally gave up and let my father put a future in front of me instead of the person I actually wanted. Tell me I'm wrong, Renata." "You're not wrong," she whispered. The silence that followed stretched long enough that even Mia, sensing the weight of it, went still against her mother's shoulder. "Your father found me," Renata said finally, and the words came out like something she'd rehearsed in the dark 1,000 times and never once said out loud. "2 weeks after you told me you loved me, he came to the coffee cart himself. Told me exactly who you really were." Told me exactly what my life would look like if I stayed, the lawyers, the press, the way people like his family destroy people like mine and enjoy it. He offered me money to leave. Enough to cover my mother's medical bills, enough to get my sister through school. Her voice cracked. I didn't take it because I wanted to leave you. I took it because I was 20 years old and terrified, and I believed him when he said he'd ruin my whole family if I didn't disappear. You could have told me, he said, if I told you. The deal was off, and he'd find another way to make sure I disappeared, one that wasn't nearly as kind. Tears were running freely down her face now. I didn't even know I was pregnant yet. I found out 3 weeks after I left. By then I'd changed my number, moved states, and told myself the safest thing I could ever do for that baby was make sure your father never found out she existed. Elliot looked at Mia, 3 years old, watching the two adults she loved most with wide, frightened eyes, and felt something in his chest cave in. 7 years, he said. You let me grieve you for 7 years. I grieved you every single day, Renata said. You don't get to be the only one who lost something. He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. Betrayal and grief, and something that felt terrifyingly close to love, were all fighting for the same space in his chest at once, and he had no idea which one was going to win. His voice failed him. I need time. I need to think. Elliot, but he was already walking away, back toward the main house. Back toward a life he'd built directly on top of a grief he now understood. He had never actually needed to carry alone. What he didn't see was Camille, standing just inside the shadow of the garden hedge, close enough to have heard every word. She'd come looking for him about the caterer's final menu. She left with something far more useful. Camille Ashford did not believe in wasted information. She stood there a long moment after Elliot disappeared into the house, turning the conversation over in her mind, already calculating. Not shock, not hurt. Leverage, a 3-year-old with his eyes. A housekeeper carrying a decade-old secret. A fiancé who'd looked, for one unguarded moment, more alive than she'd ever seen him look at her. This wasn't a crisis, Camille decided, smoothing her expression back into something pleasant as she walked toward the house. This was an opportunity. She just had to figure out how to spend it. I know that one stings, but it's about to get worse before it gets better. Stay with me for the last stretch. The truth broke Camille's way 3 days later. Not to the press yet, that would have been too crude, too easily traced back to her. Instead, she went straight to Elliot, cornering him in his own study with the same calm precision she'd used to close a difficult deal. I know about the housekeeper, she said, no preamble at all. I know about the little girl. I know your father paid her to disappear 10 years ago, and I know exactly what happens to March Holdings stock if this gets out before our wedding instead of after. Elliot stared at her, something cold settling low in his stomach. You're threatening me. I'm protecting us. Her smile didn't come anywhere near her eyes. The board finds out you have a child with a member of your household staff 2 weeks before we go public with the engagement. And that's not a scandal, Elliot. That's a story. The kind the tabloids run for months, unless you handle it quietly. Renata and the girl leave, generous severance and NDA somewhere far from Savannah. This gets buried before anyone ever digs it up. She's my daughter. She's a liability, Camille said, and the flatness in her certainty made Elliot understand all at once and completely exactly what kind of marriage he'd been about to walk into. You can be angry about that later. Right now you need to be smart. He didn't answer her. He walked out of the study instead, and in the hallway, Toddler caught his arm with more force than her age suggested she had left in her. Whatever you're about to do, she said quietly, do it because it's right, not because it's easy. What do you know about all this? Toddler's eyes were wet. I knew Anna, Renata's sister. I recommended Renata for this job the moment she walked in for her interview, because I recognized her sister's face in hers before she'd even said her name. I've watched you carry a photograph of a girl you'd never talk about for 7 years, Elliot. I put it together long before that little girl ever pulled your wallet out of your jacket. I should have told you the truth the day I hired her. I was a coward. Don't you be one too. That night Elliot went looking for the answers Toddler's confession had cracked open. And he found them buried in his father's old private files, records he'd never had a reason to look through until now. A wire transfer, A signed non-disclosure agreement with Renata's name on it dated the exact week she'd vanished from his life. Proof in his father's own handwriting of exactly what had been done and to whom. He sat with those documents until 3 in the morning, and by the time the sun came up, Elliot March finally understood who he did not want to become. He went to find Renata to tell her so. She was already gone. The cottage stood empty, Mia's small shoes missing from beside the door, the shoebox of photographs nowhere in sight. A note sat folded on the kitchen counter in Renata's careful handwriting. I won't make you choose between your company and us. You shouldn't have to, I'm sorry. R. His assistant, when pressed, admitted Renata had asked for a ride to the train station an hour earlier. Elliot didn't wait for his driver. He took his own car and broke every speed limit between Thornfield and the station, hands shaking on the wheel in a way they hadn't since the day his father first told him she was gone for good. He didn't know, tearing down the coastal highway with the sun barely up, whether he'd make it in time. He didn't know, if he did, whether there'd be anything left to say that could undo 7 years of silence. He only knew he wasn't going to lose them a second time, without fighting for it with everything he had. If you've ever had to choose between the safe thing and the right thing, this last part is for you. Let's finish it. The 7:40 into Savannah's downtown station was already boarding when Elliot skidded into the lot, left his car crooked across 2 spaces, and ran. He found her on the platform, Mia on her hip, one suitcase at her feet. Everything she owned in the world reduced to what she could carry alone. Renata, she turned, and the look on her face when she saw him, hope and terror braided together so tightly neither one could win, nearly broke him where he stood. Elliot, don't. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I read the file. He was still breathless, and he didn't care who on that platform was listening. I found my father's records. The NDA, the wire transfer, everything he did to you. His voice cracked. I should have looked harder 10 years ago. I should have never let anyone convince me you'd have left without a reason. Elliot. Camille will destroy your company if this gets out before you're ready. I don't care. And for the first time in longer than he could remember. Elliot March meant something with his whole chest instead of half of it. I've spent 7 years building an empire I don't even like, engaged to a woman who called our daughter a liability to manage. I'm done being smart, if smart means losing you both again. Mia, watching this entire exchange with the solemn attention only a 3-year-old can bring to adult chaos, reached her small hand toward him. Are you my daddy? She asked, plainly, the question it had taken the 2 adults in front of her 3 days to work up the courage to say out loud. Elliot's eyes filled. He looked at Renata, silently asking permission for the one thing he wanted more than anything else in the world in that moment. She nodded, tears sliding down her face. Yeah, baby, he said, taking Mia's small hand in his. I think I am. The fallout when it came fast, just not the way Camille had planned it. Elliot called an emergency board meeting the following week, and laid the whole truth out himself before anyone else could shape it first. He watched Camille's leverage evaporate the second there was nothing left for her to threaten him with. The engagement ended within the hour. Her attempt to paint Renata as an opportunist fell apart the instant Dolars produced Walton March's decade-old paper trail, proving exactly who had paid whom to vanish. The board, to Elliot's genuine surprise, cared a lot less about scandal than his father ever had. The stock dipped for 3 days and recovered within the month. It turned out the world was kinder to honesty than his father's generation had ever believed it would be. The harder work happened in private. Elliot and Renata sitting, cross from each other most evenings for weeks. Working through 7 years of grief and silence and misunderstanding that couldn't be fixed by one apology on a train platform, however sincere it was. They didn't rush it. They let it be as slow and unglamorous and real as it needed to be. Dolars cried the day Elliot formally changed Mia's birth certificate. Not from sadness, from relief, 7 years overdue. 6 months later, the household gathered in the garden at Thornfield for something small and unpolished. No wedding planner, no press, no seating chart negotiated by anyone but the people who actually loved each other. Just Dolars and the staff who'd watched this family come apart and stitch itself back together. And Claire, in a lopsided flower crown she'd insisted on making herself. She ran the length of the aisle before the ceremony even started, threw her arms around Elliot's legs, and announced to the entire garden, "That's my daddy," with the same unshakable, matter-of-fact pride she brought to everything she said. Elliot picked her up, held her against his chest, and watched Renata walk toward him in the last gold light of the evening, the same woman from the photograph he'd carried, folded, and faded for 7 years, finally, impossibly real again in front of him. He didn't need the photograph in his wallet anymore. He had the real thing standing in front of him, and this time it was staying. Sometimes the truth that scares us the most turns out to be the one that finally sets us free. If this one got to you, tell me which part hit hardest. And if you believe love finds its way back when it's actually meant to, drop it in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? I'll see you in the next one.